The polished marble floors of the Sterling Vance Pediatric Institute reflected the world in cold, distorted lines. To Samuel, they were a canvas of the day's traffic. The faint scuff marks left by a hurried doctor's loafers, the delicate tread of a nurse's sneakers, the smudged, chaotic trail of a child's runaway wheelchair. For 12 years, he had been the silent historian of these floors, the janitor who erased the day's story each night, only to watch a new one be written the next morning. His movements were a slow, practiced ballet of mop and bucket, a quiet rhythm against the hospital's frantic pulse of beeping machines and hushed, urgent conversations. Samuel was a man made of quiet corners and the smell of lemon-scented disinfectant, a ghost in a gray uniform, so much a part of the building's architecture that he had become invisible, and that was precisely how he liked it. In the breast pocket of his uniform, tucked beside a worn-out rag, was a small, plastic bottle of bubble solution. It was his only personal effect, a tiny talisman against the sterile uniformity of his job. It had belonged to his daughter, Maya, a lifetime ago. A lifetime that felt like a dream he could no longer quite remember, but whose ache was as real as the phantom weight of her small hand in his. He never used it. It was just there, a reminder of a different kind of light, a different kind of clean. This particular Tuesday was louder than most. The source of the disruption was a child in the main atrium, a little girl of about 6 with hair the color of spun gold. Her name was Lily, and her world was collapsing. A high, keening wail echoed off the vaulted ceilings, a sound of pure, unadulterated distress. It wasn't the cry of a spoiled child demanding a toy. It was the sound of the circuit board overloading, of a soul being scraped raw by the sensory input of the world. The fluorescent lights hummed at a frequency that felt like a drill in her ears. The gentle murmur of the lobby sounded like a roaring waterfall. Her expensive dress, a confection of silk and lace, felt like it was woven from sandpaper and nettles. A handful of nurses hovered nearby, their faces a mixture of pity and professional frustration. They offered soft words and gentle touches, but their attempts to soothe were like trying to calm a hurricane with a whisper. Standing a few feet away, seemingly carved from ice, was a girl's mother, Eleanor Vance. Her name was etched in gold lettering on the wall behind her, a co-founder and the primary benefactor of the Institute. She was a titan of the tech industry, a woman whose face graced the covers of business magazines, renowned for her ruthless efficiency and a mind that saw the world as a series of problems to be solved with data and capital. She was tall, impeccably dressed in a steel gray suit, and held a smartphone to her ear, one perfectly manicured finger pressing against her other ear to block out her own daughter's anguish. "No, the algorithm is inefficient," she snapped into the phone, her voice a blade cutting through the chaos. "We need a predictive model, not a reactive one. I don't pay for excuses. I pay for results." Her eyes darted towards Lily, and for a fleeting second, the corporate mask slipped, revealing a flash of raw, searing shame. Her daughter's meltdown wasn't a cry for help. It was a public relations disaster, a glitch in the perfect system of her life. Samuel was mopping the far corridor when he heard the sound. He knew that sound. It was the sound of a world that was too much, too bright, too loud. He rounded the corner, his cart squeaking softly, and saw the scene. The overwhelmed child, the helpless staff, the mother who was present in body but a million miles away in a world of stock prices and data streams. He saw Eleanor end her call with a frustrated sigh and march toward her daughter. "Lily, stop this. Right now," she commanded, her voice devoid of warmth. "You are making a scene. We have your appointment with Dr. Finch. He is the best. He will fix this." The word "fix" hung in the air, cold and metallic. Lily's wails only intensified, her small hands flying up to cover her ears as she rocked back and forth on the floor. To her mother, she was a broken machine. To Samuel, she was a terrified little soul drowning in a sea of noise. He stopped his cart. The professional in him, the ghost who was paid to be unseen and unheard, told him to keep moving, to melt back into the corridors. It was not his place. He was a janitor. But the man in him, the father who still remembered the exact weight of a sleeping child in his arms, couldn't move. He watched as Eleanor's face hardened, her embarrassment curdling into anger. She was about to grab the child, to force a compliance, and Samuel knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this would only make it worse. Without thinking, his hand went to his pocket. He pulled out the small bottle of bubble solution. The plastic was smooth and familiar. He unscrewed the cap, the little wand emerging, dripping with soap and glycerin and memory. He dipped the wand, brought it to his lips, and gently blew. The first bubble emerged, a perfect, shimmering sphere. It caught the harsh fluorescent light and fractured into 1,000 tiny rainbows. It floated silent and slow, a fragile dream drifting through the sterile air of the atrium. Lily's wailing hitched. Her frantic rocking slowed. Her wide, terrified blue eyes, which had been darting everywhere and seeing nothing, locked onto the iridescent orb. Samuel blew another, and another. Soon, a small constellation of silent, glistening planets drifted through the air. They wobbled and spun, catching the reflections of the worried faces, the polished floors, the cold architecture. But inside each bubble was a moment of peace. For Lily, the world of shrieking sounds and scratching fabrics and blinding lights ceased to exist. There was only the silent, gentle dance of the bubbles. A tiny, choked sob escaped her, but wasn't one of pain. It was a sound of release. She sat up, her hands dropping from her ears. She reached out a small, trembling finger, not a grab, but to gently touch one of the bubbles as it floated down. It popped, leaving a tiny, damp spot on her fingertip. She stared at it, mesmerized. A small, watery smile, the first hint of the sunrise after a long storm, touched her lips. The nurses stared, their mouths agape. They had seen millions of dollars in therapy and technology thrown at Lily's condition, and none of it had worked as instantly or as profoundly as this. Samuel remained by his cart, a silent, humble magician who had just pulled a miracle from his pocket. He offered a small, shy smile in Lily's direction, and then he felt a gaze on him, as cold and sharp as a shard of glass. Eleanor Vance was watching. Her phone was gone. Her face was a mask of unreadable emotion, but her eyes were burning. There was no gratitude there, no relief. There was something else, something dark and complex. It was the icy fury of a queen whose impenetrable fortress had just been breached by a peasant with child's toy. He had succeeded where her power, her money, and her influence had failed. And in her world, that was not a miracle. It was an insult. She strode toward him, the sharp click of her heels on a marble like gunshots in the now quiet atrium. "What do you think you're doing?" she hissed, her voice low and venomous. Back. He held up the small bottle. I'm sorry, ma'am. She just seemed so upset. I thought it might calm her down." "You thought?" Eleanor's voice dripped with scorn. "You're the janitor. You are paid to mop the floors, not to interfere with my daughter's medical care. Do you have any idea how many germs are in that filth you're blowing around? This is a sterile environment. You are contamination risk." The accusation was so absurd, so disconnected from the beautiful moment of peace that had just occurred, that Samuel could only stare. He looked from Eleanor's enraged face to Lily, who was now quietly watching the last few bubbles settle and pop on the floor, a look of serene focus on her face. "She's my daughter," Eleanor continued, her voice rising slightly. "Her care is managed by a team of the world's leading specialists. It is not an area that requires the input of the cleaning staff." She looked him up and down, her gaze lingering on his worn uniform and the calluses on his hands. It wasn't just a look of disapproval. It was a look of revulsion. He wasn't a person to her. He was a function, a tool, and he was malfunctioning. "Get away from her," she ordered. "And get that thing out of my sight. Get that thing out of my sight." Samuel, his heart sinking, quietly screwed the cap back on the bottle and slipped it into his pocket. He nodded, a gesture of quiet acquiescence, and began to push his cart away. He didn't say a word. There was nothing to say. He had seen that look before, the one that dismisses a person's entire existence based on the uniform they wear. But as he retreated down the hallway, he heard her say one final thing to the head nurse who had rushed to her side. "I want to speak to the hospital administrator. Immediately. I will not have my daughter exposed to vagrants. I want him fired. Today." The word "fired" echoed in the corridor, colder and sharper than any surgeon's scalpel. Samuel kept walking, his shoulders a little heavier, the squeak of his cart's wheels suddenly sounding like a lament. He had shared the most sacred memory he had, the one thing that connected him to his own lost child. And in return, he was being cast out like trash. The beautiful, silent bubbles had popped, and the ugly, noisy world had rushed back in. Mr. Harrison, the hospital administrator, was a man whose spine was made of jelly. He existed in a perpetual state of nervous perspiration, his primary function to placate the board of directors and, above all, the Institute's donors. Eleanor Vance was not just a donor. She was the sun around which his entire professional universe revolved. A call from her was akin to a summons from a deity, and her displeasure could cause eclipses. Samuel stood in Harrison's impossibly neat office, the scent of leather and air freshener a stark contrast to his own world of bleach and floor wax. Harrison wouldn't look him in the eye. He just fidgeted with a gold pen, his face pale. "Samuel, we received a complaint," he began, his voice thin and reedy. "A very serious complaint. From Mrs. Vance." Samuel said nothing. He just stood there, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture one of quiet dignity. "She says you engage with her child, unsolicited. You use a non-sanctioned item, a toy." Harrison said the word toy as if it were a biohazard. "Samuel, you know the protocols. There is to be no interaction with patients or their families beyond basic pleasantries. You are staff. You are here to ensure the facility is clean, not to play doctor." "I wasn't playing doctor, sir," Samuel said, his voice calm and even. The little girl was in distress. "I helped." "You helped?" Harrison let out a short, incredulous laugh. "You jeopardize this institution. Mrs. Vance is our principal benefactor. Her goodwill keeps the lights on, Samuel. It pays for the very mop you use. It pays your salary. Or, well, it did." The final words landed with a dull thud. Samuel felt a familiar weariness settle over him. He had seen this play out 100 times in 100 different ways. The powerful write the rules, and they write the story. In Eleanor Vance's story, she was a concerned mother protecting her child from a meddling, unsanitary menial. In her story, he was the villain. "So that's it?" Samuel asked, not with anger, but with profound sadness. "My hands are tied," Harrison said, finally looking up, his eyes pleading for an understanding Samuel couldn't give him. She was insistent. "You're a good worker, Samuel. I'll make sure you get a decent severance. Just clear out your locker. Security will escort you." And so, 12 years of silent, dedicated service ended. Samuel was led through the gleaming corridors he knew so intimately, past the rooms where he'd cleaned up after moments of both tragedy and joy. He was a ghost being exorcised from the building he haunted. As he passed the main atrium, he saw Lily and her mother waiting for an elevator. Lily was quiet now, but the light had gone out of her eyes again. She was staring blankly at the floor, a beautiful doll with the soul locked away. Eleanor was back on her phone, her voice once again a razor, carving up the world into profits and losses. She didn't even glance up as Samuel walked out the door, a non-person being erased from her reality. The great, automatic glass doors hissed shut behind him, and Samuel's apartment was small and sparse, but it was filled with a richness that the Sterling Vance Institute could never comprehend. It was filled with music. A beautiful, aged grand piano took up most of the living room, its polished ebony surface a stark contrast to the worn furniture. Sheet music was stacked on every available surface, and the faint scent of rosin and old paper hung in the air. This was the real Samuel. Not the janitor, but Samuel Jones, or as the world had once known him, Sammy Fingers Jones, a jazz pianist of prodigious, almost supernatural talent. He had been a rising star, playing sold-out halls, his name whispered with the kind of reverence reserved for legends. Then Maya had gotten sick, and then she was gone. The music had died with her. The applause of 1,000 strangers felt hollow and meaningless compared to the sound of her laughter. So he had walked away. He had packed up his fame, changed his name, and sought a life of quiet anonymity, a life where he could be invisible, where the silence was a comfort, not a void. Mopping floors was a kind of meditation, a way to serve without being seen, a quiet penance for a life he felt he had failed to protect. Now, that quiet life had been taken from him, too. He sat down at the piano, his callous fingers hovering over the ivory keys. He hadn't played for an audience in 15 years. But as he sat there, the memory of Lily's face, of that tiny, fleeting smile, came back to him. He thought of Eleanor Vance's cold, dismissive cruelty. He thought of the system that valued a donor's ego over a child's peace. And he began to play. It started as a soft, melancholic melody, a song of loss and quiet grief. It was a song of a father who missed his daughter. But then it shifted. A new energy entered the music, a current of righteous anger, a bluesy, defiant rhythm that spoke of injustice. The notes became sharper, more complex. It was the sound of a man who had been invisible for too long, a man remembering who he was. His fingers didn't just press the keys. They danced, they flew, they bled his story into the air. The music filled the small apartment, a powerful, undeniable truth in a world built on convenient lies. A few days later, a thick, cream-colored envelope arrived in his mail. It was an invitation. The Sterling Vance Pediatric Institute was holding its annual Benefactors Gala, a black-tie affair to raise money and celebrate the Institute's achievements. Tucked inside was a formal request addressed to Mr. Samuel Jones. It was from the gala's organizing committee. They wrote that, on the dying wish of the Institute's late co-founder, Arthur Sterling, they wished to once again invite him to be their special musical guest. Arthur Sterling had been a dear friend and patron of Samuel's, a man who loved jazz more than balance sheets, a man who believed in the healing power of art. Every year since his death, they had sent the invitation to his old agent, and every year it had been politely declined. But this year was different. This year, the gala was being hosted by Arthur's widow, the woman who had added her own name to the Institute and reshaped it in her own, colder image, Eleanor Vance. Samuel looked at the invitation, then at the grand piano that dominated his room. A slow, determined fire began to burn in his chest. He picked up the phone. "Yes," he said to his former agent, who nearly fainted on the other end of the line. "I'll do it." The night of the gala, the Institute was transformed. The sterile, white atrium was now a sea of black tuxedos and glittering evening gowns. Waiters circulated with trays of champagne, and a string quartet played softly in the corner. It was a monument to wealth and influence. Mr. Harrison scurried about, his face gleaming with sweat and sycophantic smiles. At the center of it all was Eleanor Vance, a vision in a diamond necklace and a midnight blue dress. She moved through the crowd with the effortless grace of a shark, accepting compliments, shaking hands, her smile a perfectly calibrated instrument of power. Tonight was her coronation, a celebration of her vision for the future of pediatric care, a future of AI diagnostics, robotic surgery, and data-driven therapies, a future that was efficient, sterile, and perfectly controlled. After the dinner and the auction, it was time for the keynote address. Eleanor took the stage to thunderous applause. She spoke eloquently about metrics and outcomes, about leveraging technology to eliminate human error. She painted a picture of a future where sentiment was a liability and data was king. "The legacy of my late husband, Arthur Sterling, was one of vision," she said, her voice ringing with false modesty. "But vision must evolve. We must move beyond the quaint, sentimental notions of the past and embrace a future built on the hard, undeniable truth of numbers. We are building a new paradigm of healing, one that is precise, predictable, and powerful." She was met with a standing ovation from the assembled titans of industry and finance. She smiled, basking in their adoration. This was her world. This was her victory. Then, Mr. Harrison nervously stepped up to the microphone. "And now," he announced, his voice trembling slightly, "for a very special performance, a man whom my friend Arthur Sterling called the true soul of music. After a 15-year absence from the stage, please welcome the legendary Mr. Samuel Jones." A polite, curious applause rippled through the room. The lights dimmed. A single spotlight hit the grand piano at the center of the stage. And from the wings, a man in a simple, perfectly tailored black suit. A collective gasp went through the small group of nurses and staff who were present. Mr. Harrison's jaw dropped. the color draining from his face as if he'd seen a ghost. And on the stage, Eleanor Vance froze. Her perfectly calibrated smile evaporated, replaced by a mask of pure, uncomprehending shock. Her mind, so adept at processing data, couldn't compute this. The janitor, the filthy, meddling janitor, was on her stage, being introduced as a legend. Samuel walked to the piano and sat down. He didn't look at Eleanor. He didn't look at anyone. He just took a moment, his hands hovering over the keys. The room was so quiet you could hear the clink of ice in a forgotten glass. He leaned into the microphone. His voice, when it came, was not the quiet, deferential tone of janitor. It was the rich, resonant baritone of an artist, a voice that commanded attention without demanding it. "Good evening," he said. "My friend, Arthur Sterling, believed that a hospital wasn't just a place to fix the body. He believed it was a place to soothe the soul. He knew that sometimes the best medicine isn't found in a syringe or a pill, but in a moment of human connection." He paused, and his eyes slowly panned across the room, finally landing just for a second on Eleanor. Her face was pale, her composure utterly shattered. "I was here a couple of weeks ago," Samuel continued, his voice soft but carrying to every corner of the vast room. "Not as a guest. I was just watching, and I saw a little girl who was lost in a storm. The world was too loud, too bright for her, and all the science and technology in this magnificent building couldn't reach her. The people around her were trying to fix her, to manage her, to make her quiet, but they weren't trying to understand her." He let the words hang in the air. The audience was motionless, captivated. This was not the speech they were expecting. "And then," he said, his voice dropping to an almost whisper, "I saw someone offer her something simple, not a diagnosis, not a procedure, just a moment of quiet beauty. A simple, fragile bubble. And in that bubble, for a moment, the little girl found peace. The storm inside her stopped." He looked directly at the crowd now. This institution, in its pursuit of the future, must be careful not to forget its past. It must not forget the vision of a man like Arthur, who knew that the most advanced technology in the world is useless without a human heart to guide it. The soul of this place isn't in its algorithms or its balance sheets. It's in its capacity for kindness. It's in the moments when one human being sees another's pain and offers not a solution, but a moment of grace. Without another word, he turned back to the piano, and he played. The music that poured out of him was the piece he had composed in his apartment, but now it was alive, breathing with the energy of the room. It was a story of grief, of anger, of injustice, but ultimately of hope. It was a torrent of emotion and truth that washed over the audience, stripping away the pretense of their tuxedos and gowns. The music spoke of a father's love. It spoke of a janitor's dignity. It accused no one by name, but it laid bare the truth for all to see. It was a hymn to the invisible people, to the quiet power of empathy in a world that worships noise and strength. When the final, heart-wrenching note faded into silence, there was a beat of stunned stillness. And then the applause began. It wasn't the polite, obligatory clapping from before. It was a roar. It was a thunderous, cathartic release from people who had been moved to their very core. They rose to their feet, not for a celebrity, but for a man who had shown them a profound truth. On the stage, Eleanor Vance stood alone, a statue in the storm of applause. The donors, the board members, the people whose approval she craved, were not looking at her. They were looking at the janitor. In that moment, her fortune, her power, her name on the wall, it all meant nothing. She had been publicly, devastatingly, and gracefully humiliated. She had been defeated not by a corporate rival, but by a bottle of bubble solution and a song. Later that night, long after crowds had gone and the caterers were clearing away the last of the champagne glasses, Samuel was packing up his sheet music. The atrium was quiet again, the floors once again waiting for his mop and bucket, though he knew he would never push them again. "Mr. Jones." He turned. It was Eleanor. She had changed out of her gown and was wearing a simple blouse and slacks. The diamonds were gone. Her makeup was gone. Her armor was gone. She looked smaller, fragile. "What you did tonight," she began, her voice hoarse. "It was cruel." Samuel looked at her, his expression not of triumph, but of a deep, weary sadness. Was it, or was it just the truth? Was it more cruel than having a man fired for showing your daughter a moment of kindness? She flinched, the words hitting her like a physical blow. She had no defense. I don't understand, she whispered, the words sounding alien in her mouth. I give her everything. The best doctors, the best schools, the best technology. Nothing works. She's unreachable. Maybe, Samuel said gently, you're trying to reach her with the wrong tools. You're a builder, Mrs. Vance. You see a problem, you engineer a solution. But a child's heart isn't a machine. It can't be programmed. It just needs to be seen. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small bottle of bubbles. He held it in the palm of his hand. My daughter's name was Maya. She was terrified of the dark. No nightlight, no science, no explanation could fix it. But she loved bubbles. So every night, I'd sit by her bed and blow bubbles in the moonlight. She said they were like little floating stars that kept the shadows away. It wasn't a solution. It was just connection. Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes. For the first time, she wasn't a CEO or a billionaire. She was just a mother, lost and afraid. She looked at the bubble solution in his hand. And for the first time, she saw it not as a contamination, but as what it was, a key. Weeks passed. Samuel didn't return to his job. The Institute offered him an artist-in-residence position, endowed in Arthur Sterling's name, to bring music into the sterile halls. He accepted. One afternoon, he was walking through the Institute's garden, a place he used to rake leaves in quiet solitude. He saw a flash of gold hair. It was Lily. She was sitting on the grass. Looking up, above her, a stream of shimmering, silent bubbles was floating up into the blue sky. Samuel followed the stream down to its source. There, sitting on the grass with her daughter, her expensive suit replaced by a simple sweater, was Eleanor Vance. Her phone was nowhere in sight. In her hand was a small bottle, and she was gently blowing bubbles, her face filled not with frustration or embarrassment, but with a look of quiet, focused love. Lily reached out and popped one, and a real, genuine laugh, as clear and beautiful as any music, echoed through the garden. Eleanor looked up and saw Samuel watching. Her face didn't hold any shame or anger. She simply gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. A nod of thanks. A nod of understanding. A nod that acknowledged a debt that could never be repaid with money. The transformation wasn't complete, but it had begun. The Queen had learned a lesson from the janitor. The data-driven mind was beginning to learn the language of the heart. This story reminds us that true poverty isn't a lack of wealth, but a lack of empathy. A person's worth is not defined by their job title or their bank account, but by the quiet dignity of their character and the simple kindness they show to others. Eleanor Vance had a world of power at her fingertips, but it was an invisible janitor, armed with nothing but a memory and a bottle of soap, who possessed a truer, more meaningful strength. He didn't just bring a moment of peace to a troubled child. He held up a mirror to a broken system and reminded a powerful woman what it truly means to be human.